Well, good morning, and thank you all for being here. My new title is Chief Evangelist. Am I on? No, I'm not on. You know how you do this? You hit the on button. Okay, now you hit the on button and it works like a charm. Anyway, about a year ago, someone gave me an award for being an evangelist. So I do weddings, baptisms, that kind of stuff, and we decided that was going to be my new title at Supplier Wisdom, which is a division of Neo Group. But having been in the industry a long time, and I started out as a tool set in super regional banks, and then I was at Citi, and I worked in various parts of the world for Citi, and then I was with Deutsche Bank, both in London and in New York. And of course, we had operations all over the world. So one of the things I learned when I first got assigned to go to Tokyo, because Citi had a problem in Tokyo, I got there and I showed up and I said, well, I'm from corporate. And then after about 2 weeks, when the corporate folks started calling me, I used to say, stop calling me. You have no idea what's going on in Asia. Your rules do not apply here. And I learned a lesson there that we have to be flexible. We have to understand what's going on from a governance and regulatory perspective, not only locally, but globally. And we're really fortunate today to have a really great panel. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about kind of where governance was in the past, where we are now, and where we're going in the future. So we have a couple of switches because of a commitment. So one of our panelists, Uma, is delayed. He'll be here a little bit later, so he'll join another panel. So where are my folks? Doug, where's Doug? Doug, here's Doug. Okay, Doug, come on up. And Keshia, is Keshia here? No, oh, she's not here yet? Okay. And Andy? I am here. You're here. All right. So what we'll do is take a couple of minutes, folks. I'd like you guys to introduce yourselves, and when Keshia gets here, she'll jump in, and then we'll kind of run through the program. So, Doug, why don't you take us away?
Hi, I'm Doug Ausnehmer. I work at Abbott, and I lead our supplier management organization. We might have a little bit different scope than some of the other vendor management organizations that you have. We focus on the big managed service contracts that we have.
Great. I'm Andy Gottschalk. I'm with Emergent Holdings. Emergent Holdings is part of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. So we're basically a holding company. That's kind of all the for-profit businesses that Blue Cross has. So we have a very wide variety of businesses. So we have property and casualty insurance companies with a focus on workers' compensation. We also have a big Medicare Advantage program, and that includes our own platform, which we sell as kind of a BPO service known as Advantasure. So my role is I'm managing director for sourcing and vendor management.
Okay, thank you. What we're going to do is, this is not about me speaking, it's about hearing from those folks up there, and also all of you. So we put an hour aside for this session because we really believe we need to get a good understanding of, again, where we were, where we are, and where we're going. Because there's a lot happening. So when you really think about it, oh, I should have had that slide up. You know, Joe Namath used to say, I can't wait for tomorrow because I get better looking every day. So where are we? Well, governance in the past was reactive, and I'm going to ask you guys to comment on this. We made some modest enhancements, and we sort of moved it into the cycle, into the business life cycle. But where were we? We were at the end of the life cycle. How many people here are on the risk assessment side? Right? You do risk assessments, you do reviews, you're in a control position, either data privacy or IT, CISO, corporate legal, whatever. Right? They come to you after the deal. They show up with the contract. Okay, we're ready to go live on Tuesday. Can you do your due diligence? Can you validate? So where we need to be is we need to get away from that and move it to the front of the system design lifecycle. Risk-related, and I call them related risk assessments. I was talking to a couple of folks. Who's the lady from Sarasota? Used to be in Sarasota, right? Weren't we talking about risk assessments? Risk assessments are time-consuming and so on and so forth. They're also episodic. Right? By the time you get it done, it might be outdated. So those are some of the things. And, of course, the big one is the regulatory challenges. No one is exempt. I don't care what business you're in. You are now, if you have data of any kind, GDPR, CCA, DFS 500 from New York, Nevada has a new one coming out, you're in. So This is the easy part about being a moderator and not being a panelist. So Andy, what do you think about this stuff? Why don't you kind of give us your perspective on where we were?
Yeah, it was funny. I actually was thinking about your story about, actually kind of brought back memory about being on the opposite side of that. So 2008 was a tough year for a lot of people. The financial crisis and everything hit. For me, it was a great year. I was actually like overseas, my first job kind of outside of corporate. So I was having freedom. I was running this nice little shared service center. Life was really good until I got the call from corporate, come back, we need your help. And while I had been overseas, the company had embarked on a huge SAP implementation. We had a system integrator that was running crazy, and they needed help trying to get some control over that. So for me, that was one of my first big experiences. I came back into the situation where the system integrator was basically running the show, doing all kinds of crazy things, and the scale and the complexity of it was like mind-blowing. Like I had never been up into it. Was dozens and dozens of business units, global, hundreds of millions of dollars being spent. And really the governance that we really focused on back then, it was purely just about control. So at that point, the executives were realizing we're being run over by the system integrator. We're just looking for basic control. So we want control back over how much money we're spending. We want control over the spend. And we want control back over the key decisions and making sure that those are being made at the right level. So for me, that was really like a big eye-opening moment. When I was running my little shared service center over in Europe, it was much easier because, there was a small team. I knew most of the people by name. I could handle things kind of much more on a relationship basis. And the realization when I got back to corporate was that's not enough, and that you really need the kind of processes and discipline around governance to make sure that you were in control of what you were doing. So I think in terms of where we were, when I think back to that time, for me, it was a lot about control over spend, control over your information, control over your decision making.
Usually late in the game. Doug?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think where we've been at is we've been very much a siloed organization, which I think many of you, as I see your heads nodding, are buying decisions are either were made in the business, not necessarily with the overall enterprise in mind. And as a result, what did you get? You got lumpy results. Lumpy results from either supplier management. Oh, wait a minute, this division used it. They were great. Then they went to the other division. Well, they were awful. Well, why would that be? Well, it's either team. It's because they just were let loose. We have one supplier who literally had it's a commercial-oriented supplier, so some of you probably know it's not very far from here, that they would just let loose in the organization. So they were making all kinds of deals everywhere until we kind of tried to rein it in. And we still, organizationally, have that issue ultimately. So how do you break through that? But we're very much in the present, unfortunately.
Interesting. What are you guys seeing about, the whole world of risk assessment, which is an important component of governance, right? While you may not do the risk assessments yourself, you're somewhat involved in them, right? Anybody here from the CISO side? IT security? Right? How many of the 1,000 questions do you guys have to deal with when you send out the risk assessment? Many. That's a big number. No, it is. It's true. It's really usually the bulk of the assessment. Anybody else? Well, you guys actually do them.
We kind of guide clients through the risk assessment process, but we stay kind of on the external audit side, so we don't actually do them for the clients. But we really guide a lot of clients through that process.
So what kind of groups do we have in here? Let me see. How many people are from the IT side? Okay. How many people from the procurement purchasing? Oh, there you go. Oh, now all right. Oh, really good. Now I know who to pick on. All right, so we're all set here. We got somebody we can pick on. But okay, what other kind of shout out? Who else? What other groups do we have? Somebody give me an idea. Who else is in the room? Software. Supplier operations. Okay. Finance and IT. Software. Okay. All right. So you can see there's a great cross-section of people, and yet we're all exposed to this new regulatory challenges that are coming. right? What are some of the ones you're seeing, that are happening kind of that we've dealt with, and then we'll get to what's coming. Doug?
So I was just going to talk about security, and we have a vendor evaluation process, and it's very episodic. It's very static. And what has happened is each of those suppliers have, generally speaking, gone digital in one way, shape, or form. They've bought into it. They're doing robotic, whatever it is. They've developed new practices, and by policy, we've been driven by. Oh, now we have this new, I'll call it application for lack of a better word, new service offering. Have we gone back in and said, hey, vendor A, well, you're doing all this cool stuff. Wait a minute. Are we really prepared for all those things? Are your connections into our systems, any of the other attributes that you're trying to control? Are you really under control? And that, I think, still is one of those challenging areas. Certainly with all of the digital investment that we're making, do we have the suppliers, certainly in a regulated space, that are paying attention to the things that are important to us? And it's not just data, it's everything. So I think that's where we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, I would say, so we're in mostly healthcare related, so we're very regulated, PHI, PII. So we have a lot of the vendor risk teams and all these kind of same things that everybody has. But what I've seen like recently that's more interesting to me is there's a lot more integration. So like when we work with our CISOs or internal audit, we're actually bringing them much further forward into the process to participate. So we just did an RFP recently for application development maintenance. It was a pretty significant transaction for us. And, the CISOs were right at the table from the very beginning. They participated in collaborative solutioning. They went with us to India to do due diligence trips. And I thought one of the, and I this wasn't my idea, so I'm not bragging, I won't take credit for it, but one of the coolest things was we actually brought the internal audit group along with us too. So rather than having them come in 6 months later and tell us all the things we missed, we actually had them come along with us, participate in some of the sessions with the vendors, do the due diligence trip, and really provide active input into, what would they like to see from an audit perspective. And let's try to get it right the first time instead of waiting a year, getting a high-risk audit, and then spending another 6 months. So for me, I think the biggest change that I've seen is much more willingness to be proactive and collaborate earlier in the process, and that can be a big help.
One of the things we looked at, and I'm going to, Mark, I know we have a couple of questions. One of the things I just want you to keep in mind as we go through this, and there's supply chain and there's source chain. And I kind of separate them in over my career. Supply chain was inbound, stuff coming in. So you had an opportunity, well, you needed the controls and the governance, but you had an opportunity to stop something if there was a problem. When you're talking about data and sourcing, especially in the financial industry, healthcare, insurance, once you have data entrusted to you, and I send it out to, what's your name? To Gail, so I send it to Gail's company to process, that's it. So my control governance over Gail's company is more important. So think about that as we go, because the data is already out there. Mark, I know you had a question.
Yeah, it's just a question for the panel. Interesting to know that, so we talked about being actively upfront, engaging our business partners or our IT solution. What about during the relationship, change management? So how do you bring in the reassessments or an audit for a change of technology or a changing of an integration or deployment of a new technology from that aspect? Have you guys, is that tied to a contract change per se? We have to do a reassessment or a reevaluation from an IT standpoint? Just interested in if you've got that solved.
Good question.
No, I don't have. We don't have it solved. I think real quick. I think the biggest challenge, it's typically a contract change, but I think what has happened is because we've gotten to these big MPSA level kind of agreements, the risky stuff kind of gets slid into the master contract, and as a result, it doesn't trigger anything. Like if it was a big contract, a master agreement, then everything gets reviewed. And I think that's what's happened is I want to buy this. Okay, great. They go out and buy this. Procurement does a deal. and everything's wonderful. And then it's like, okay, who's responsible for the next steps? Whether it's governance, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter. But ultimately, that's where I see the big gap is. If I'm the business sponsor, I should be the one saying, okay, I know what the risks are. I should be, doing all the right evaluations. I know what our recipe is for this kind of supplier, da 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 da. And quite often, what you don't see that. There's not that follow through.
Yeah, I think very similar. I see it happening ad hoc, but not, so for this transaction that we're doing right now, we're in transition, and we've got probably 500 resources that are going to be exiting, and for us, that's a big number. And, I know for a fact that we're going to get audited on all the onboarding and offboarding, and do you know where all the laptops are, and did you shut off everybody's access, and can you, again, going to audit kind of before you just do like a spot check, like here's our documentation, here's our approach, here's who's involved, can you just give us early feedback? Do you see any gaping holes here? And, our goal is to kind of do a couple things. One is to try to catch any gaps that we have earlier in the process by having a fresh set of eyes on it. But we're also trying to build that relationship and trust so that when they come back and audit, we can have a good discussion. They've got some of the background. They understand that we're open and we're trying to do the right thing when it comes to controls. But to your point, it's still very ad hoc.
We have another question.
It's more a comment than a question, because I hear your comments about the ad hoc nature of governance in the organization. There's pockets of the organization that does it very well, and there's a large part of the organization that doesn't do it very well. And I think that what I'm starting to see, because I look at this on a global basis as part of my job, Europe is starting to develop very different from the US. If governance in European companies is starting to develop much more like a finance function that has complete oversight over the whole organization, where I think in the US you don't see this globe or enterprise-wide approach to governance of contracts. The US, in my mind, is a lot slower in getting there. And it's almost like the light bulb went on about 18 months, 2 years ago in Europe, and now you see governance organizations, and particularly the CPOs that have a new role. Their job is not to negotiate contracts and et cetera anymore and see if they can get the lowest price. It's now about post-contract management of those contracts, complete different role. And I think that hopefully will come to the States sooner or later, where you then will start to see a more consistent level of governance across all functions within an organization.
Thank you. So let's jump in. Now we're going to get to, we started to talk about, and you guys brought it right in where we are today. So I guess when you look at a couple of the major questions, one is, have we embedded governance in the business? Or are we still on the outside trying to look in and fight our way in? Another important component, having been on the risk and control side most of my career, was, have we moved governance and controls and compliance from no, you can't do that, to working with the business on how you can do that? So we need to comment on that. What are the primary drivers beyond just regulatory, and maybe even beyond just revenue? There are other drivers. And the last thing is that we need to talk about is, and you hear about it, you hear about top down all the time, right? Everybody says top down, gotta have top down. The board has to support it in the C-suite. Well, I always use top down to my advantage, but I always used to say more important than top down was cash at the bottom. So you can have all these great ideas, and someone said it was, but then they don't want to pay for it. So I think that's important. So those are sort of the 4 topics that we'll cover. So I think we'll do the same thing again. Why don't you guys jump in, Andy, Doug, comment on these, and then really we want, if you have a question, get your hand up. Don't be shy. All right? Come on, guys.
Yeah, I would say on the integration with the business, it's quite varied. So we've got a kind of a lot of different businesses in our portfolio. So I would say, like on the property and casualty side, we still have a lot of kind of the same conversations we were having 10 years ago, like how much are you going to allocate? How many people do you have on your team? Can we compare rate cards? So it's still pretty like tactical. not where I would like to see it, but moving in the right direction. I think there are other parts of the business where the C-suite is basically saying, we like what you're doing. We need more of it. We're moving faster than ever. We want you guys to be integrated. And so I think there's a kind of a wide variety that we see, but definitely moving more in the direction of being very integrated with the business and very visible at the C-suite level.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I think some of us have is we have such different businesses within our portfolio enterprise, if you will, that we still tend to have buying decisions and arguably governance decisions being very decentralized. So you may have, and you could even go on the science side, the clinical trials. We have very significant outsourcing arrangements with quintiles of the world, et cetera. Do we really have the same level of control that we have on Genpact or IBM or Cognizant and some of the others? And I think the answer is no. And in a large part because it's a divisional decision, and does that division understand what it signed on for? Hey, yeah, I got to do the clinical trials. I need to, go get the best in the world, but the aftercare. And what does that mean? And I think what has happened and still is happening is effort at the highest level, necessarily top down, but at least have the conversation. Don't just kind of bury your head in the sand and just say, hey, great, I signed this awesome deal, now what? And I think that still is a challenge. And I think the folks that do it best are that do take an enterprise view and ultimately say, how do I leverage that relationship across all my business lines in order to create the best enterprise value? I know that's very cliche, but that is the case.
A question about cloud subscription. So, if you go back to a few years ago, if any department, any business function was trying to license software, it was very clear you end up going through a procurement sourcing process because they were not small. Today, you jump on, you sign a subscription to Zoom, Salesforce, you name it. Can you talk a little bit about any kind of gates you guys have put into place so that you're not risking your company's data? Because that's so often many of these applications, you're exposing your data. Can you talk a little bit about that? And how has governance changed around that?
I think the biggest change that we've experienced is just the knowledge that we have multiple points of failure or multiple buying points, and how do you consolidate that and coordinate that in a fashion that doesn't quite frankly create chaos. And I think that's where we've been. Now where we are today is we are much more cognizant, for lack of a better word. We're much more aware of what we've built from one division to another division, one function to another, and are now looking at it more from an architecture perspective. Because quite frankly, before it was just, I'm a commercial organization, I need to get that visibility, give me what I want, rather than looking at it from a functional perspective and say, hey, look, let's have an enterprise view of whatever this is, sales or whatever, that ultimately will drive better leverage points within the enterprise.
Is there a gate people have to go through?
Yes. So we've actually what happened, and this is maybe a little bit too much information, is we had multiple people buying, we had multiple contracts consolidated under one contract, and then ultimately consolidated the demand and ultimately started to squeeze on the call it on the bottom line, but looking at the licenses and saying, okay, are you really using these licenses? So starting to reuse the licenses, looking at a more stringent demand management process. So rather than doing annual buys, we're probably doing quarterly buys, and getting screaming at the back end by the business saying, hey, I need it in March, not in April, and ultimately just managing through that. But ultimately, I think what they're seeing is more control, better value in terms of price point, and ultimately it does frustrate the supplier. But at the end of the day, how do you really manage where it was previously unmanageable? And that's the only way, is start the organization and then, really develop a more best-in-class kind of organization to support that.
Yeah, I'd say we've got multiple stage gates. So we've got, vendor risk teams. We've got our audit teams. If you're doing offshore, there's a process for that. So it's very regimented and stage gated, and we're very locked down on our data, which is all very good. But I think what we're trying to do is figure out how we can do that in a more integrated way that is more oriented towards, what are the business outcomes we're trying to get. So the challenge we have is a lot of times we go through all those multiple steps, and it tends to be very pro forma. So the teams are saying, okay, did you complete this risk assessment questionnaire, the 12 questions? Yes, they were answered. But what we struggle with is kind of stepping back and saying, what's the purpose of all that? So as a quick example, for some of our businesses, we just say, we don't want any PHI offshore, period, zero, and that impacts a lot of what we can do from a sourcing perspective. And we're trying to have more conversations about, okay, that's a very good conservative, safe place to start, and there's good reasons why those rules were put in place. But, let's have a conversation about, are all those things that were relevant when we made that decision still as relevant today? How much additional risk is there actually from having a data center in Chennai versus having it in Lincoln, Nebraska? And so trying to get away from sort of the checkbox mentality and a little bit more integrated and proactive and business aligned with how we make those decisions.
You had a question about Kirk?
Yeah, with where we were with governance and where we are today, I was wondering if you see, I'm hearing a lot of operational governance around vendor management, but if you bring it up into the second line, third line of defense there and understanding the corporate governance, so information security usually has its own governance program. You've got compliance and legal with their programs, and are you seeing the need to connect more closely and integrate the siloed governance and orchestrate it so you don't have security running you down one path, the compliance folks running you down a different path, duplicate testing, duplicate requirements, duplicate reporting type stuff? So where are we at with progressing into more of a integrated corporate governance model where vendor is a portion or a subset of the big picture, the big G governance?
Yeah, I've been with Emergent Holdings for about 8 months now, and I'm still getting surprised finding out that there's this team over here, and you have to get their approval before you can do that type of a transaction. It's a huge challenge for us, and part of it is our structure because we've got Blue Cross, and then we're a holding company, and then we've got all of our portfolio companies beneath us. So there's multiple layers. So it's a big challenge. I think there's a huge appetite for it though. So I feel like it's a good time to push forward some of that change, but we've still got a lot of that kind of same tactical embedded mentality around it.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge we have in general, and we haven't solved it, is what access are you pointing to? Are you pointing to spend? Are you pointing to risk? Are you pointing to data? Are you pointing to another dimension? And then ultimately, is there a one-stop shop, one model that fits all of them? And there's not. But ultimately, you got to pick one and then pivot from that and say, okay, let's do an annual review or whatever frequency you want to look at and say, okay, are these still the top 10? Are these still the ones that we really want to pay attention to? And I think we haven't gotten to that point where it's got the elasticity that it needs and flexibility. But we need to get there because, to your point, we have, some body will say, these are the top 10. Another body will say, these are the top 10. And then yet another body will say, this is the top 10. Well, you probably have some similarities, but at the end of the day, we're running around doing things to ourselves that we shouldn't be doing as a result of not being organized, kind of big G on down. So we haven't solved it, but that's something where we need to get to. And I think the other thing organizationally is the challenge is if, predominantly I spent a lot of time in IT, we only recently brought the organizations together from a reporting perspective. So that was another, hurdle you had to get through. The divisions had their own money, could spend and do whatever the heck they wanted, and quite frankly, didn't have to talk to anybody else. And so now that you're starting to bring it under one umbrella, now you're seeing people to be a little bit more disciplined and thinking about, I'll call it their brothers and their sisters, whereas before they just didn't care. Just didn't care.
I'm going to change my role. I'll become a panelist for a minute. One of the challenges we faced at Deutsche Bank when we took over vendor risk was that there were 17 control functions who wanted to opine. Well, how about you opine quickly? But that was one comment. But what we did is we actually we had all these stage gates and went through the risk assessment process. So we created what was called stage gate 0. And stage gate 0 was that at business case development, at the earliest stage of, SDLC, we started having the businesses ask the control functions a question right away before they even went into figuring out the final design and the budget and the timeline. Well, I remember I got a call from someone in data privacy in the US who said to me, "You can't do this. This is a violation of corporate policy." I said, "What's a violation of corporate policy?" "We're going to have a call with my boss." So I said, okay. So we got on the call with Domenico Romanazzi, who was a friend of mine who ran data privacy out of Germany. And I said, Domenico, what's the problem? He said, well, I don't know. And we asked the local guy to get on the phone. He said, do you realize people are calling me and asking me questions about data privacy? So I said, Domenico, I think we're done here. He said, oh, yes, we are. The issue was we got the control functions into the front of the system design lifecycle. Make a decision. Ask a question. What country is going to be the toughest one to roll out in? One size doesn't fit all. Don't put Singapore in the front of your rollout list because it takes time to get approval. So those are some of the things that we were started to think about and we worked on. Any more questions? Because we're going to jump ahead now. Hey, oh, here you go. I have a question. Here's my first question. How am I doing so far?
You're doing excellent.
All right, thank you. Okay.
You're outstanding.
All right, thank you.
Okay. I wanted to go back to a tools question a little bit because what we're finding is it's very fast and easy to sign up small contracts that don't have capital, so they don't need to go to the old capital committees, and it's not big enough contracts to go to, and all of a sudden we're finding them when they want to interface into our IT systems, right? And all of a sudden it's already signed, they bought it, and now we're at the interface point. So how do you guys get ahead of those? Because those are coming at a very fast clip and the business is very empowered to do those.
Thank you. That wasn't an easy one. Come on, guys.
That's the hard one. No, I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have is just that, is connecting the, quality systems. We have non-quality systems and quality systems, those that are more related to product. And so, often that evaluation isn't done whether quality or not quality. It's just kind of done in a blanket, kind of siloed perspective. And they don't really think about, okay, well, what are we really going to do? What's the end game here? And how could we use it? Again, that comes back to, someone, and the question is who, and and we haven't solved this issue, is someone needs to be responsible to say, oh, wait a minute, before we were going to just use it here, and now we're using it here, and here is really, really bad. Really bad meaning more regulations, more, privacy concerns or whatever. We just haven't connected those dots. And the thing that I think is happening, or at least I'm seeing happening, is that the business is taking a more active role, and they're trying to get in front of it, whereas before they probably didn't. And so now I think we're really trying to push the business to stand up and acknowledge, okay, you brought in supplier ABC 123, you're responsible for it. So now if it starts going astray, if you will, in the areas that it wasn't the intended purpose, how do you do whatever you need to do by policy, procedure, whatever, to now update, review, compliance, get the appropriate parties involved?
Those are processes that if people are following it, it would never happen. This is a story where people are actually not following the process. So, one example that I've seen in some of our clients is you actually can't download software until IT actually approves it. So the system won't let you do it. Are there other moves like that that either you guys have seen or anybody in the audience is trying to do? So you prevent that ability for somebody to even sign up.
Yeah, we're not very good at that. but I think where I have seen some success though is by, if you make it easier to do it the right way than to do it the wrong way, then people will come back. So like we have, I'm part of kind of a new leadership team. And so one of my colleagues is the chief architect. And so he's very fast moving. And so he likes to do like hackathons. And so, you know, he did a hackathon, he had a bunch of design firms come in, and in one day, you know, he picked his vendor, and then he realized that, you know, he didn't have a contract. He didn't realize all all the different things. And then that back end process of having to do it after the fact cost him months on something that he thought was going to be a day-long process. And so now we're continuing to do those same kind of hackathon things, and they're actually very effective. But, you know, he and I are collaborating at the front end to make sure, you know, does procurement understand? Does legal know what you're doing? You know, do you have the right form of contract to use? And just kind of lining it up and making it easier to do it the right way than to try to ask for permission after the fact.
Has anyone comments about how you've solved a similar situation? I'll get back there with the mic, but why don't you just jump up, Kirk? You can.
I think a big element, large insurance company, a couple hours south of here, and the biggest thing that we do when we go through the contracting and procurement process with the business is the business has to speak to the risk before the contract is executed. And if the contract is written to enable your sensitive information to be processed elsewhere, oh, but we're not going to do that for 4 years, and then 4 weeks later they're back saying they want to go with it. It's more of you need to speak to the risk, and you're only authorized to go what you are describing in your risk management plan. And then the big governance monitors and detects and prevents the expansion into other areas. And if there's that expansion occurs prior to that risk being known, then our senior leaders, a good portion of their compensation is variable. And the first criteria is, are you compliant? And if you're not, that's a big decision to make and to not be sure about what's going on. So that's where I think the corporate governance structure and model and an understanding of what is it's not a point in time from a risk management perspective, it's an ongoing change occurs. What's the loop back into your risk management discipline that helps you get the business to go versus no? And so for us, it's been a big challenge in getting those governance structures to talk to each other and to get the behavior at an executive level to understand what the expectations are.
Thank you. You know, a lot of it, as we all know, it depends on data. Right? It's all data focused. And I'm going to ask my friend Bo to just comment about, and Bo's with a company called Sapiens, but talk about the different requests you're now seeing for people looking for data and how they're using it. Would you mind?
Sure.
You're not allowed to sell.
I'm not selling anything, but we do see a lot of folks. Yeah. I mean, you know, what we do is we collect data, right? And I like to call it the Fitbit for corporate America, right? And so essentially what we're doing is we're collecting data across the enterprise, both internally, externally, and also on bots. And what that does is it gives you a snapshot of what's happening in reality. Because a lot of the information we get up front is self-reported. The vendors are giving you their hours reported through a system like Clarity or whatever that is, right? You have employees internally that have subjective ideas about what's happening. And you're taking that and you're putting it all in your modeling systems and you're making assumptions around information that's not true, right? And once you get that data and it's real, the decisions become much more effective and they're measurable and they start to fit into those governance models. So that's what we're seeing, and there's multiple use cases, whether it's a software utilization case, employee efficiency, optimizing vendor contracts, changing how we view SLAs, right? Because SLAs could be 10 years old. Are they pertinent today? Are we measuring the right things? So that's what we're seeing.
Thank you. I know we have another question in the back. Yeah, wait.
So I would like you guys to comment on governance and innovation, because sometimes too much governance could be on the way of innovation. I mentioned this morning about innovation and governance. Every company must innovate today, And when you look at governance, it's about, making sure things stay the way they're supposed to be, they run the way they're supposed to be, you're able to cross out everything. But innovation doesn't work that way. Innovation is about things you don't even know. And you guys mentioned hackathon earlier on, trying new things, breaking things. And they just sometimes don't work very well together. So I would like, not just the two of you and people in the audience to talk a little bit about what's the role of governance and innovation, or is there too much governance in innovation?
So I love this topic. So this is such a good one. My experience has been that if you try to over-engineer it, it doesn't work. So having mechanisms of we're going to have so many ideas and track them, and you need to submit this, and it's going to get reviewed. It doesn't work. I've never seen it work. Maybe a tool you have, but I think it's a challenge. What I have seen work is just where governance creates an environment and a culture where there's trust and mutual respect and understanding between the supplier and the customer. And that's what tends to foster good innovation and risk-taking. So for me, it's more about governance creating that environment where those things can happen, as opposed to trying to over-engineering it and forcing it to happen.
Yeah, and I think it all comes back to culture, arguably. I hate to go back to that, but if you have a culture of fail fast, innovation, et cetera, generally speaking, you see that throughout the organization. And so there's more willingness to innovate. But I think in an organization like mine that is much more conservative, is much more of a manufacturer than really an innovator, but only recently is now getting in the innovation game, they have a hard time kind of letting go of the, you only have one chance. You fail once, you're done. And I think but that bleeds over to your suppliers. So are you willing to put in, do the joint innovation funds or whatever you want to call them to build up something interesting, new, et cetera? And in large part, in some organizations, certainly ours is one, we shy away from that because, quite frankly, we can't honor our end of the bargain, if you will. We're not willing to actually, it's great that they want to give us the money to innovate, but we don't actually, reciprocate and put the. And I think that's, again, it goes back to culture. If you have a culture of innovation, guess what? You're going to get things that people they're going to stub their toe, but they're also going to hit a home run at the same time. So, and I think that just bleeds through the organization.
Yeah, I used to say when I was at General Motors, when people asked me to put innovation in the contracts, and I asked them, what do they mean by it? I let them go on and on for a while, and then I said, so in conclusion, what you're telling me is, if there's something you forgot to put in the contract, you now want the supplier to provide it at no cost to me going forward. And then they kind of shake their heads. And this is exactly what most organizations mean by innovation, right? And there's actually a very good example of how innovation can work on contracts. If you look at R&D type contracts where there's no clear outcome, there's an idea, and you go through milestones, and at each milestone you determine whether it's worth continuing or worth stopping, because you're not going to see value out of it. You don't see the path to a success. I think if you build that kind of thing into your contracts, it tends to work pretty well. So there's not a specific amount, there's not a specific amount of effort. It is a program or a project you agree on with milestones where you evaluate both sides, whether it makes sense to continue or not to continue. But I think the second point that was made is on the environment that needs to be created. It is really critical because still today, if you look at companies, 80% of the dialogue between the client and the supplier is about whose data is correct, right? It becomes a battle of data versus working together with a single source of the truth. If you haven't solved that problem, you're not going to solve the other problems. So you really have to look at the environment you're creating. Is there a reasonable, fair governance practice for collaboration? And does your systems work in such a way that you both look at the same information all the time? And of course, you need to think about, I have 10 suppliers or critical suppliers. Am I looking at 10 different systems or one system? All of those things play together. But the environment is critical, and then how you deal with innovation. It can work, but not in the way most people think about it.
Thank you, Claude. Atul, I know you had a comment.
So 2 quick examples where I've actually seen it work that might be interesting for others to think about. So one of the suppliers I won't name, they for a annual contract value over a certain amount, they assign a CTO. That CTO covers 4 clients. So you basically get 25% time off their CTO. It's dedicated, so you as a client know who that is. That CTO comes in once a quarter, and literally their job is to present to the client every quarter an idea that some other client is using or something they see in the marketplace that can be applied to the client. Now, they cannot come in and just say, here's an idea. They actually have to make it apply to that client, and that's the reason why they're dedicated. And this is baked into the contract, right? Now, at the end of the year, the evaluation is, did that CTO really do their job or not, right? There isn't a number attached to it, but they thought that, we were actually part of the deal. They thought that having a dedicated way of doing this would potentially help. The second quick idea, this is the medical device company. The first was a CPG company. Medical device company, on a renewal of contract, they consolidated to a single vendor. They created an innovation, what they call it, an innovation fund, had no money in it. But basically for every savings that was generated in the new contract, a third went to the supplier, third the client kept, and a third was invested back in the contract for whatever it was. So the supplier in this case does lose a third, if you think about it, right? The hope in that whole deal is because it's a single vendor that they would continue to get more business in the future. So 2 very practical ways of trying to create, one case a gain share, the other case simply a contractual requirement to come back with ideas.
And as we go through the day, and then when you leave, these questions, take them back with you. Ask yourself the question. Talk to your teams about them. I mean, how are we going to deal with accelerated delivery? How are we going to deal with agile? What's going to be the impact of crowdsourcing? We can talk about some of those things right now, which we will, but all of this, take it all back and think about it and ask yourself the questions again. So that's something that's important. I mean, we talk about, everybody's hot on agile and DevOps. Well, I've been in the business so long, I remember when we had something called application development and maintenance. Application development was in the dev side, maintenance was in the production side. Never the twain shall meet. Right? I always tell the story at Citibank. At Citibank, if a dev person was in a production server, you as the manager were not only fired, they took you outside and shot you. Those were the days. That was our primary control, and it worked well. That's going away, right? With DevOps. So I think we should talk about some of these things. We have about another 15 minutes or so, and then we'll do questions and everything within minutes. We're going to extend. No, I'm only kidding. So let's go through that. Let's think about some of it. Anyone is in that environment now dealing with Agile DevOps, let's jump in. But if you guys could just take a couple of minutes each and just say, some of these topics, where are we with RPA and AI and ML and all the buzzwords? I got every buzzword I could think of up there. So, except data science, that's going to be next time.
The interesting thing is we've got different groups handling each one of those areas, and never the 2 shall meet, or 3 or 4 meet. I think one of the challenges we have in general is and we have a background. We have a legacy landscape that is unparalleled, I think, in the world. We have 145 ERPs or something like that, depending on how you classify ERP. So it's awful. But it ultimately is how do you look at and plan for investment with RPA or any of those things with the backbone of systems that you have, or is the new version coming around? S/4HANA, will that overtake what your current SAP environment is? And you can think about all the other systems. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in general as an organization and as an entity. That's one of the things we have to get our arms around. But ultimately, when it comes back to how do you do DevOps, we haven't solved that. We haven't solved Agile. And again, because regulated environment, multiple systems, how do you try and separate someone who only does work up here from someone who only does work over here? And then you throw in potentially a third party, and it's a spaghetti bowl.
Yeah, so we're committed to doing an agile transformation of our sourcing organization in 2020. So I'm learning a lot about it, and I'm very excited about it. And one of the key things I'm learning is just a completely different mindset. So it's really about changing the way you work. So it's not about sticky notes and all this sort of stuff. It's really a mindset shift. So we're pretty excited about that. In the meantime, kind of what we've developed is basically like a bimodal sort of way of doing things. So we've got our traditional path with procurement and legal and all these different vendor risk, all the things we've talked about. But we've kind of created an alternative path that is basically where, if the CIO, the CEO are saying, this is something high priority, we're willing to take risk, move faster, and, just get a small group of people working on it and do it. So we did an acquisition of a care management company recently, and, we basically just kind of carved it out of the normal processes. And, the CEO was like, we're willing to take risk on this. You're authorized. I want to close by this date. Go for it. And so it was fun for me to be a part of it. I was like involved in like details, like marking up confidentiality agreements and things like that I hadn't done since I was a second-year attorney. And so it was much more like in the weeds on it, but it was a small group of people, and it was very agile, and we were able to get the deal done much more quickly. And so right now we're kind of in this, we call it bimodal. And so it's good because we've created this space where we can kind of pull out of our normal processes and, move fast if we think there's benefit to it. And we've got the right people that are willing to sign up for the risk, and the risk is understood. But we've got the traditional mode for the rest of it. And in 2020, we're committed to kind of taking a look at the entire thing and seeing if we can bring that same kind of mindset to all of our supplier management and all of our sourcing activity.
We have a question, Yali, from
No,
Paul University.
more like a comment. So I won't say the name of the company, but a major airline company in Chicago, maybe I shouldn't say that. I'm sorry. Discussing DevOps issue just 2 weeks ago. I'm part of an association that with IT. Anyway, what they did was that they started hiring UI UX within their DevOps organization. So so they start looking at problem from the user experience standpoint, and he actually built up a very big UI UX team within his DevOps, and that's something new for that very organization, because traditionally you don't have UI UX as part of DevOps. You have engineers and all that, and he did that intentionally to start building up his agile practices, and then ask the question, how do we roll out Agile into DevOps? Well, there are some Agile practices that works very well with DevOps, maybe not Scrum, but things like Kanban, which is more like a flow, and it's easy for people that have been in doing DevOps traditionally to accept that without making so many changes. So that is something we saw a couple of weeks ago within a very large organization similar to yours. Governance structure within that organization.
Well, listen, thank you. I know we have another question up front or a comment, and we'll then we'll make it quick. That's right. We'll move ahead. Here you go.
Is everybody getting RPA fatigue? Is it at the top of your list when you go home at night and go, oh, I don't know, maybe we don't need to.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, we've made a conscious decision as an IT organization that we're not going to talk about RPA. It's just part of what we do, and it's an extension of kind of logical functionality. It's not sort of a separate initiative that happens. So I think, yeah, I would tend to agree. But it's not going away. I think it's just becoming business as usual.
Yeah, I think it's another tool in the box, if you will. I mean, I think we're looking at it more as not necessarily RPA, it's automation, and you don't just automate something for the sake of automating. And that's kind of, I think you've heard that. I think everybody's heard that. But ultimately, I think once you get into it and really start looking at what the benefits are the benefits, do they outweigh the cost? And certainly, I think we're seeing with a fragmented process, not a fragmented systems, fragmented process, you can't really harness the power of AI, power of RPA, the power of any of those things without getting a template and say, here are the 5 fields, and these fields are always used to do X, whatever X is, master data. Think about any of those things. You've got to really harden the process.
And a lot of times, how many people have been in this situation where someone says, we have to automate this, but the process is terrible. But we're going to automate it anyway, because now we'll have a faster bad process. Right? Yeah, we'll be digitally bad as opposed to manually bad. Well, listen, thank you all very much. Thank you to our panel. I appreciate you guys doing a great job.